this lesson, we'll cover rooms and room tags. Rooms and room tags are actually an architectural function, but it still does relate to elements that we'll create in future lessons for MEP. For rooms and room tags, the model that I have on my screen, if I zoom in, I see I actually have a few rooms and room tags already predefined. And if I move over the room tag, I actually see it highlights, and it does say room tag. And if I move my mouse a little bit again, I actually will see the actual room itself. Now, the room and the room tag actually can be placed individually or placed together. The rooms can be added before the tag names and room tags, or you can add the rooms to a room schedule and then place those rooms that are already predefined. Let's say we first want to place a room without any predefined tag or room name. To do that, let's go to the Architecture tab, then over toward the right on the Room and Area panel, click Room. Now when you click Room, you'll see other predefined rooms already highlighted. On your options bar, it's saying the room is going to be limited to the first floor. It's giving me an offset height, so we have a volume or an area. And then if I look at the room drop-down where it says New, I don't have any names in this list. Now, if you had room names already predefined but weren't tagged or placed, they would be in this list. And we'll look at that in a minute. But right now, there's none in this list. So we're just going to create a new room and simply move into an area that is bound by walls. So as you can see, as I move my mouse around between these three offices on the right, I can place a room, or in the corridor or hallway, I can place a room, or in this conference room on the left, I can create a room. We're going to create a room in that conference room first. So just move into that space and left click. Once you left click, go ahead and zoom in. Notice that the room is actually placed, and it gives the name of a generic room called room and a number sequentially counting up. Now, let's go ahead and click modify. So that actually places the room. Now, you could change the room name right here simply by clicking twice on the room, and I can change the name, in this case, to conference. Now, one thing you may want to do is keep consistency. So if your room tags are all in caps, let's make this all in caps. And I'm just going to call this conference. For the room number, same thing. I could change it here if I have the access to do that. If I can't change it here, I'll change it in a room schedule. Now in your browser on the lower left, we already have a room schedule predefined. So just scroll down to room schedule and double click room schedule. When you see the room schedule, you'll actually see the conference room that we just added and which we just changed the name of. Here's actually the room number. I'm going to change the room number to 101 and then hit the enter key. We can go back to the plan and create additional rooms, or we can add the rooms to our schedule and then go place them after they're already predefined. So let's do that in this example. So I want to add 3 more rooms, Office 1, Office 2, and Office 3. To do that, let's go to the Insert drop-down on your ribbon and click Data Row. It will add a new data row and call the room Room. And it will start with the next number from where we left off. So the last one I numbered was Conference Room 101. So this one now changes to 102. Let's rename this to Office 1. And if the number is not 102, change it to 102. Note the area on the right reads not placed because we didn't place it yet. Now let's add 2 more offices. So go back to Insert, Data Row again, rename this room to Office 2, and it'll be number 103. Finally, go back to Insert one more time with Data Row, and rename this room to Office 3, and it's room 104. And then just click off of the schedule. So the schedule now has been created, and we created the actual room names along with their numbers. We just need to place them now in our drawing. Go ahead and close this view. I can just click the X in the upper right for close for this view, or if you wanted to go back to the plan view, I could scroll back up underneath floor plans and double click A-level 1. Then zoom back out or zoom in around the three areas on the right, which we'll tag for 3 office spaces, or rooms. So let's go back to the Architecture tab, go to the Room and Area panel, and click Room. Now, everything is the same as what we did the first time when we placed the conference room, but this time, since we already predefined 3 rooms, if I look at the room dropdown where it reads New, I see my other 3 rooms that I haven't placed yet. So just select 102 Office 1, and let's place this room. And I'll start with this one at the bottom. Now I'll go back up to the dropdown again. I'll select Office 2, number 103, place it above this. And what you'll notice too is you place rooms, you'll have alignment lines appear. And finally, go grab the last one, 104, and I can place it as well. And then click Modify once you're done placing rooms. Now, if you placed a room and you didn't include the tag or you deleted a tag, you can actually use the tag room function to tag the actual room itself. It would place a tag on that room, either reading from data already created, or it's going to create the generic room label with a next number. Now let's go look at our room schedule one more time. So scroll back down to Schedules Quantities and double-click Room Schedule. What you'll notice now for Office 1, 2, and 3 is that the area is filled in because it's now assigned a room or a physical space within your building. Go ahead and go back to the A-Level 1 floor plan and zoom back out. So as a review, what we covered in this lesson was rooms and room tags. We looked at different ways to place rooms and their tags. First off, by just creating a generic room label and having a room number sequentially count up. Once we placed that room, we manually edited the name of that room and or number. Another option we looked at was creating or going to a room schedule table that's already been defined and adding our rooms there before they're actually placed. Once we added our rooms to the schedule table, we then went back to our model and placed our rooms, but made sure we selected the room from the room dropdown for which we wanted to place in that actual space. In this lesson, we'll cover creating spaces. So you may ask, well, what's the difference between a space and a room? Aren't they the same? If I've already created rooms, do I need to create spaces? Well, they are different, and yes, you should create spaces, especially if you're going to use MEP. Rooms and room tags are mostly used for architecture. They define the room and number the room, and associate everything in that room with that room number and room tag. Spaces, however, are used on the engineering side. They're used, for example, with MEP. They hold all the engineering data that's required for analysis, such as HVAC analysis. So yes, you do need spaces if you're planning on running analysis and using MEP. Now, should the spaces in rooms be named the same and numbered the same? Yes, technically they should. And you can place the spaces either manually, meaning clicking each room and it'll create a space in that room area defined by the boundary of the walls, or space lines or room lines, or you could use a utility from Autodesk called the Space Naming Utility. They'll actually analyze all the rooms that you have and create spaces for each room using that room name and number for the space. Now that's a free utility you could download from Autodesk called Space Naming Utility. For our example here though, we're going to place spaces manually. The first thing I want to do, especially if you're linking an Architect's Revit file into your MEP project, which we are doing right here. The walls, doors, windows, everything you see is the architect's model. We're working in the MEP model or project though. So the architect has already defined rooms and room tags. They're not visible in this view, but they exist. First thing I need to do is tell Revit that this linked architect's model, I want it to allow me to use the rooms for creating spaces. So to do that, let's just move your mouse over the model. And when you do, you'll actually see a blue binding box, or basically a blue rectangle. And it's going to define this is the linked Revit file, the architect's file, if you will. Go ahead and click on it. Once you click it, you'll see the properties on the left in the properties area. Click Edit Type. On the Edit Type window, I want you to check mark the constraint for room bounding. That will allow us to now see the rooms for when we create spaces. Click OK. And then simply click off the model anywhere in the white area. Now we're ready to place spaces by recognizing rooms that are already created in the Revit Architects model. So to place our spaces, let's go to the Analyze tab. Then on the Spaces in Zone panel, let's click Space. Now since we activated or turned on room binding or bounding, we'll actually see when you move into the rooms, the space picks up those predefined rooms. So I'm going to start by just clicking in 3 spaces. One which is our conference, one which is our Office 1, another one which is Office 2, and another one which is Office 3. If I already had the spaces named based on spaces in a schedule, I could select the drop-down and choose the space name. Since we don't in this example, I just place the spaces individually. Notice the upper limit is level 1 for each space. It's taking a total of 8 feet. All that is going to be used in calculations for analysis for mechanical systems within that space. Click Modify. Now, if we want to modify the space names and tags, simply move over the space name. When you click on it once, you actually see the binding area of the space. When you click on the text again, you can actually change the naming of the text space tag. In this case, I'm going to call this one Conference, based on what we called it in our previous example, and then click off of it. To change the number, I'll simply click on the number and change the room tag to 101. And I'll repeat the process for the spaces on the right, changing these to Office 1 with a number of 102. And then the second office will be Office 2 with a space number of 103. And then finally, our last office is Office 3 with a space number of 104. Now, if we use the utility, the space naming utility, it would have automatically named the space names and numbers pulling from the actual room reference. Now, one thing you may want to do is change the visibility graphics of the actual linked Revit file to display the room tags so you actually can see them, or go to the actual schedule table to actually see the information for the rooms and how they match with the actual space tags. So as a review, what we looked at in this lesson was creating spaces. We talked about the 2 different methods of creating spaces. One manually, where you basically just click a room and it creates a space within that room. Or 2, using the space naming utility to create all the spaces from rooms that are already predefined. We looked at the first method, though, creating spaces manually. First, we turned on the ability to see the rooms from our linked Revit Architects project. Then we used the space tool to move over those rooms and place a space tag. We then changed the name of the space tag and also updated the space number. In this lesson, we'll cover space separation. So you may ask, well, what is space separation? Space separation means you're taking a space and dividing it into multiple spaces. You may say, well, why would I want to do that? Well, it has to do with zones, or think of heating and cooling within a building. You have different thermostats in different places in an office, and that thermostat controls a zone, which could be consistent of multiple spaces. But let's say one of your spaces crosses between zones. Can't have that, so we need to actually separate that space or make a separation line so that space can now be in one zone and the other part of it in the other zone. For example, if I look at my office building that I have on my screen, one zone will probably be the 3 offices. Another zone will probably be this conference room. Another zone will probably be the corridor and all the rooms in the back. And then another zone will probably be the reception area, the middle women's restroom, and the corridor up front. Looking at that, that means I would have a zone here in the front part of the corridor and a zone in the back part of the corridor. But right now, the corridor, as you can see as I highlighted in red, is one area, or in this case, one space. So really what I need to do is split that. And to do that, we'll use the space separation technique or tool. So to split a space or create a separation line for a space, Let's go to the Analyze tab, and then on the Spaces and Zones panel, click Space Separator. This will now let you draw a line through a given space, dividing it at that line. So I want to actually split this actual zone, or the corridor, right in the middle. So I'm going to move my mouse to where I see a midpoint on one wall, left click, and then drag across to the wall opposite on the other side, and then left click again. And what will happen now is it actually splits that space. So you can see right now, as I'm still in the command, Corridor 101 now is just a space for that back corridor, and the white area on the bottom now is an undefined space. So I'm done with the separation technique, so click Modify. Now all I have to do now is to create another space for the beginning part of the corridor. So to do that, go to the Analyze tab, click Space, and then move into the undefined space to place a new space tag. Go ahead and click, and then click Modify. Now I've placed that space, and I can see it's space 112. Well, I want to rename that to corridor and give it the number 101A. And then I could rename the other corridor to 101B. To do that, I could do it right here on this screen, or I could go to my space schedule. So I can scroll down in the project browser on the lower left to schedules and quantities, and then double click space schedule. This will display my current list of spaces. So for the existing corridor, I'm going to change the numbering to 101-B. And then I'll find the space that we just created called space, and I'm going to rename that to corridor, and I'll renumber it to 101-A. And then based on the sort technique of the table, it updates and places those in numbered order. Now let's go back to our plan view. So I can scroll all the way back up to Mechanical, HVAC, under Floor Plans, 1-Mechanical. And now I can see I've updated those space tag names and their associated numbers. So in this lesson, what we covered was creating space separation lines. And we did that because we have a large space that is going to eventually span multiple zones, and those zones control the heating and cooling of that given area. So therefore, I needed to split a space in two, in this case, the corridor. I used the space separator technique, the tool located on the Analyze tab, to draw a line to divide the corridor space in the middle of our building. And then I created a new space tag for the undefined space, and finally, we renamed the corridor name and numbers. In this lesson, we'll cover creating zones. We already know that spaces are created in MEP in order to run analysis on the elements and area within that space. For example, HVAC analysis. Our next step, once we have spaces, are to create zones. Zones would be an area that's controlled by certain temperature or humidity or any other elements within that area, or in this case, zone. So looking at my model, I want to create different zones based on the different spaces within this model. So I could probably say Office 1, Office 2, and Office 3 is a zone because I want all three of those to have a central or a common temperature control. I would like maybe the reception, men, women's, and corridor 101A to be another zone. Corridor 101B, the break room, mechanical, electrical, and utility spaces will be another zone. And then the conference room will be a zone in itself. So to create these zones, let's go to the Analyze tab, and on the Spaces and Zones panel, click Zone. Now when you click Zone, the ribbon actually changes, and you actually see the Properties button, Add, Remove Space, Finish, and Cancel for zones. First thing I want to note is, since properties are highlighted, the name for this zone. And you may have to scroll down to see this. Right now, the name for this zone is Zone 1. You can leave it that way, or you can change it. We can always change it later in a zone schedule. So to add a space, in this method, click Add Space if it's not already selected, and then simply move over the spaces you want to add to the zone, and click. As you click each space, they'll be surrounded by a black rectangle, indicating that is the zone. Once you're done with this zone, click finish editing zone, and it adds a zone now to your model. Let's repeat the process. Go to the Analyze tab again, click Zone, verify Add Space is selected, note the name is Zone 2, and now we'll select everything at the front of the building. The reception, Corridor 101A, men's and women's restroom. Finish editing. Repeat again, click Zone, this time everything in the back, Corridor 101D, reception, mechanical, utility, and electrical. Finish, and then finally, click Zone one more time, and click Conference, and then finish editing. And what we've created now are 4 zones inside of our building. So as a review, we looked at creating zones to group spaces together for various different types of controls for temperature and humidity within that area. Now, the method we used to create zones was we went to the Analyze tab, clicked Zone, and then started to click the different spaces we wanted to add to that zone. We also looked at the properties like being able to change the name of that zone. Now, another method which we didn't explore to create zones is first select your spaces, then click Zone, and the zone will be created for those highlighted spaces. But the method we used was more of the manual method of clicking Zone and then picking the spaces you want to add to that zone. In this lesson, we'll cover the system browser and the zones we just created. So in a previous lesson, we created zones from spaces, and the spaces were originally developed from rooms. How do we go about viewing information in a model, such as zones? Well, one method is if you have a schedule, you could browse to that schedule to see this information. So for example, if I scroll down in the project browser in the lower left to schedules, I have an HVAC zone schedule. And I can double click that and I can see the zones 1 through 4, the perimeter, and the gross area of each zone. Now I can display other columns of information as well for volume and other types of calculations that can be used for various analysis of each zone. Maybe you want to see which spaces belong to each zone. Well, another way to view that information is through the system browser. So let's go back to our previous view. It was the mechanical HVAC floor plan 1-mechanical. The system browser by default is turned off. To turn the system browser on, let's go to the View tab and then all the way to the right to the User Interface drop-down. Go ahead and click it, and then check mark System Browser. When you display the system browser, you see a variety of things. Right now, we're looking at systems. And I could see mechanical, piping, and electrical. We have no systems because we really didn't create any yet. If you click the system drop down to the right of view, you're going to have an option called zones. Go ahead and click zones. Now you're listing the zones we created. Now you do have one called default, meaning every Revit project you create does have a default zone. And by default, all your spaces belong to that default zone unless you create new zones and assign those spaces to them. That's what we did in the previous lesson. So to see the spaces that are in zone 1, I can click the plus to the left of it. And if you hover over zone 1, it'll highlight on the actual model each of those elements. And you can mouse over each one and it'll actually highlight those on the actual model itself. Expand zone 2, click on zone 2 and you see zone 2. Same thing with zone 3. And same thing with zone 4. Or I could individually click and you can see each of the spaces. But the system browser lets you actually view from a hierarchy standpoint, in this case, all of your zones and all of the spaces that belong to each zone. Now you do have the control to resize and to add or remove columns to the system browser. So as a review, in this lesson, we looked at the system browser and zones. We first started off by looking at a zone schedule to actually see the zones in their area and perimeter, for example. But we wanted to see more about what spaces belong to each zone. So we enabled the system browser by going to the View tab, and then the User Interface dropdown, and turning on the system browser. From the system browser, we changed the view option to zones, And then we're able to see the actual zones and all the spaces aligned to each zone. In this lesson, we'll cover area and volume calculations. Now, we've already created our spaces, and you can see our spaces actually have the space name and space number, and we know the space is calculating area and volume, but it's not being displayed. So how do we go about that? Well, first of all, let's just double check to make sure those calculations are being calculated and see how they're being calculated, meaning like finished surface to finished surface of your given walls. So to see the calculations or the setting, let's go to Analyze tab, then go to the Spaces and Zones panel and click Spaces and Zones dropdown. From here, choose Area and Volume Computations. On the new window that opens up, verify area and volumes are being calculated at the finished faces. And verify the finished faces is at the wall finish, and then click OK. So now that we know those are being calculated, we need to display those on a tag. And to display those on a tag, simply click on one of the tags, such as Conference. The properties will appear on the left, and then click Edit Type for the space tag. Now on the new window that appears, you see under Graphics you have two checkboxes, one for volume, one for area. So this can display now those calculations or totals for each space. Checkmark Show Area, and then click Apply. What you'll see now is the total area of each space is now displayed below the tag. Uncheck Mark Show Area and check Mark Show Volume, and click Apply. You'll now see the volume displayed under the tag for each space. If you click both area and volume, it actually displays both values, but they're on top of each other. And that's because the symbol, the space tag symbol, actually has that created in itself. So if you actually want to display both the volume and the area in the space tag, you'd have to actually edit the tag itself and modify the arrangement of those numbers so they're stacked and not on top of each other. For now, though, let's just leave the Show Area checkmark and uncheckmark Show Volume and click Apply. And then click OK. And then click in the background to deselect. Since that is changed and set to Show Area, if you were to create a new space, by default, and you can see this here, it says Not Enclosed, meaning that I do not have it over an enclosed area, but once you move over an enclosed area, you actually see the area calculation with the tag. Just go ahead and click Modify. So what we looked at in this lesson was area and volume calculations for our space tags. Now you can also apply the same thing for room tags if you were creating rooms within your architectural plan. But since this is mechanical, we looked at applying the area and volume to space tags. Now, we first looked at the actual calculations for area and volume to verify they were calculating. And then lastly, we looked at turning on or editing the space tag annotation symbol so it now displays either area or volume. In this lesson, we'll cover color schemes. So in previous lessons, we already defined our spaces and we already defined our zones. So in the model on my screen, you can see each space has a space name, space number, and an area. You also can see the outline of the zones. Those zones contain multiple spaces. Maybe we want to add a color scheme for our spaces, or maybe we want to add a color scheme for our zones, or we could do both. So the first thing you would do is create a new view, and that view, give it a new name, or let's say color, for the actual floor plan, and then we would apply the color schemes. So first of all, let's look at the color schemes. So to do that, for specific color schemes for zones and spaces, let's go to the Analyze tab, then to the Spaces and Zones panel, click the Spaces and Zones dropdown, and click Color Schemes. Now what displays are the color schemes currently defined within Revit. Right now I'm looking at the Spaces category on the left, and there's a default scheme called Schema 1. On the right are all of my spaces with the current color assigned to each space. Now, you could change the color, the RGB number, the Pantone number, or select and choose a variety of different colors on your own. You can also duplicate the scheme to create new schemes, and I could use the icons in the lower left to duplicate the current schema and then change the new one, or I could rename the current schema, or you can't delete this one, but you could delete other schemas as well if you created new ones. Also, if you wanted to look at different types of schemes based on different types of categories, you can see that by clicking the drop down under category. Currently it reads spaces, but I could change that, for example, to HVAC zones. When I do that, again, I have one schema, but now I see my 4 zones, and each zone has a color scheme to it. In other lessons, when we get into creating different types of systems, ducts, plumbing, we can actually create color schemes for those areas as well too. Go ahead and click OK. Now that we looked at how we can define our color schemes and where we define our color schemes, the next step is to apply a color scheme to this view. So without anything being selected, I'm currently looking at the floor plan properties, and it says floor plan on the left in the property box. If I scroll my mouse down in the property box until I get to the entry color scheme, once you are at the entry color scheme, click None on the right. This will then display very similar box to what we just looked at, but here you actually pick the scheme that you want to use for this floor plan. So I'm going to set the category to spaces, and then I'm going to select Schema 1. Again, this is what we saw a little earlier, and this is the current scheme that I'm going to use. All of these are visible, and these are the colors that are currently set, and they're solids. Go ahead and click OK. What happens now is this floor plan is color-coded based upon that scheme. Now that scheme was based upon spaces. But let's say you wanted to change that, and I want the scheme to be based upon zones. Well, once again, make sure nothing is highlighted or clicked upon. So the floor plan is in the Properties box. Scroll down to Color Scheme. Click on Schema 1 on the button on the right. And again, we're back to that same window. This time, change the category from spaces to HVAC zones, and then select Schema 1. Your 4 zones are listed with the associated colors and a solid fill pattern. Click OK. Now your model changes to a color scheme based on zones. So as a review, in this lesson, what we looked at is how to create or find current color schemes within Revit. We looked at how the color schemes are definable by spaces, by zones, by rooms, or other mechanical equipment. We looked at how we could change the color of the current schema. We looked at how we can add new schemas or rename schemas. And then we went to the actual plan view and looked at how we can change the color scheme for the plan, where we first created a color scheme and assigned the scheme to spaces. And then lastly, we changed that scheme to reflect a schema for zones.